All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going deep into the world of cornsnake morphs, specifically the Tessera morph.
Yeah, these Tessera Cornsnakes are really something special.
That's right.
I mean, we're talking some seriously intricate patterns,
Yeah.
Like little living artworks.
Yeah, like the Picassos of the snake world, right?
Exactly. And you know what makes this deep dive even more interesting?
What's that?
We're going to be looking at this cork with the Super Tessera variety.
Oh, yeah, the supers.
These are the snakes that get 2 copies of the Tessera gene. And get this, they're consistently smaller than their single gene counterparts.
Huh, that's pretty wild.
It is. And to really get into it, we're going to unpack this study by Brian Lobsher that breaks it all down.
Perfect. So for those who might not be super familiar with snake genetics, let's do a quick recap.
Sure. So basically, you've got genes that can be either dominant or recessive. It's kind of like a tug of war,
I'm following.
And in the case of the Tessera morph, the stripy gene is dominant. So even if a snake only inherits 1 copy of that gene from one parent, it'll still have those cool stripes.
So it's like inheriting a superpower, but only needing one parent to pass it down.
Exactly. But when a snake gets 2 copies of that dominant gene, bam, you get a super tessera.
Double the power. But as this study shows, sometimes doubling up can have some unexpected effects.
Yeah, for sure, like impacting their size.
So let's get into the specifics of that size difference.
Yeah.
The study followed a bunch of Tessera snakes, both the single gene and the super tesseras, from the moment they hatched up to a year old.
Right.
What exactly did they find?
Well, the super Tessera Cornsnakes were on average about 8 to 12% smaller right when they hatched.
Wow, so they're coming out the gate a bit smaller already.
Yeah, and then by the time they hit their first birthday, they were about 5 to 10% shorter and 10 to 15% lighter than those single gene Tessera siblings.
Those numbers may not sound huge to some people, but in the snake world, that's a pretty significant difference, right?
Definitely. And the researchers, they did some hardcore statistical analysis to make sure this wasn't just random chance. They were really thorough.
I'd hope so.
Yeah.
We're talking about science here after all.
Absolutely. They got a p-value of less than 0.05, which means they're super confident that the Tessera gene is playing a role in this whole growth difference.
So it's like finding the smoking gun at a crime scene.
Exactly.
Mystery solved. Or is it? So we know super tesseras are smaller, but the big question is why?
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated.
Oh boy.
The study looks at a few different explanations. One idea is this thing called pleiotropy.
Pleo what now?
Pleiotropy. It's basically where one gene can have multiple effects on an organism.
So like a multitasker gene.
Yeah, like imagine a light switch that controls both a ceiling light and a fan. Flipping one switch affects 2 things.
Okay, that makes sense.
So maybe the Tessera gene not only controls those cool stripe patterns, but also somehow influences growth.
So it's like a 2-for-1 deal, but maybe not the best deal if you're hoping for a big snake. What other theories are out there?
Well, another possibility is that super tesseras just have different metabolisms, like how some people can eat whatever they want and never gain weight.
Yeah, I know a few people like that.
Right? Maybe super tesseras the same way as their single gene buddies.
So they're like the super speedy metabolism folks burning through calories in a flash.
Exactly. And there's one more idea. Maybe the gene actually affects their skeletal development. Like it leads to slightly smaller bones, which then impacts their overall size.
So we've got this genetic puzzle on our hands.
Yeah, we might need more research to totally crack the code.
Totally agree. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the folks who work with these snakes every day. The breeders. What does this size difference actually mean for them?
Well, the good news is the study didn't find that super tesseras have more health problems or anything just because they're smaller.
That's a relief?
Yeah, for sure. But there are a couple of things for breeders to think about. First, super tessera clutches. They seem to have slightly lower hatch rates than clutches from those single gene tessera pairings.
It's a bit more of a waiting game for those super tessera babies.
It can be, yeah. And of course, there's the size difference itself. If a breeder is specifically going for larger snakes, that's something they'll need to consider when they're planning their pairings.
So it sounds like this study gives breeders some good info to make those decisions.
Totally. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to responsible breeding.
Couldn't agree more. This has been super fascinating. We've jumped into the genetics of the Tessera morph, figured out why those super tesseras are smaller, and even talked about how it affects breeders. But we're not done yet. There's still so much more to unpack. Like, what does this all mean for the snakes themselves? What are the implications of being a smaller snake? We'll be back right after this quick break to dive into all of that.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about those super Tessera cornsnakes and how they're consistently smaller.
Yeah, it got me thinking, while it might seem like a disadvantage at first glance, could there actually be some upsides to being a smaller snake? I mean, nature's all about balance, right?
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. Smaller size could actually be a benefit in certain environments,
Really?
think about areas where resources are scarce.
Makes sense.
Smaller snakes, they don't need as much food to survive, so they might actually have an advantage there.
So it's like survival of the fittest, but in this case, it's more like survival of the smallest.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing to consider.
What's that?
A smaller, more compact body could mean increased agility.
Interesting.
They can slip into tighter spaces, navigate through dense undergrowth, maybe even evade predators better.
Yeah, a bigger, bulkier snake would have a harder time with that, right? Like trying to squeeze into a tight spot.
Exactly. So you see, while we often associate size with strength and all that, there are definitely times when being smaller can be a real asset in the wild.
Totally changes my perspective. I mean,
Yeah.
we've gone from talking about dominant and recessive genes to the potential benefits of being small.
It really shows you how much we still don't know about the natural world, right?
It's pretty humbling.
Absolutely. And this study, it just opens up so many cool avenues for future research.
For sure.
Like we talked about those metabolic differences, remember?
Yeah.
Now the question is, do super testers actually process nutrients differently? And if so, how?
So many questions.
And what about their skeletal development? Could there be subtle variations in their bone structure that are contributing to their smaller size?
It's like peeling back one layer of the onion only to find another layer underneath.
That's science for you. Every answer leads to more questions.
And for those listeners out there who might be thinking, okay, this is all cool, but I'm not a scientist or a breeder. Why should I care? I think there's a bigger message here.
Definitely. It goes beyond snakes and stripes.
Totally.
This whole Tessera morph deep dive, it's really a tiny glimpse into the complexity and wonder of genetics in general.
It's like this secret code hidden within every living thing.
Yeah.
And the more we unravel it, the more we understand how life itself works.
Exactly. And who knows? What we're learning about cornsnake genetics today could even have implications for understanding human genetics down the road.
Now, that's a mind-blowing thought.
It is. So you see, this deep dive is about so much more than just snakes. We've talked about genes evolution, even the ethical considerations of breeding.
It's been quite the journey. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to the study's author, Brian Lobsher.
Good idea.
He has some interesting recommendations for future research.
Oh, he does. He suggests expanding the study to include more snakes and following them into adulthood.
Makes sense. The more data, the better, right?
Exactly. And he proposes some other really cool ideas, too, like looking at their metabolic rates through blood tests and diet studies.
Wow. So we could actually measure how efficiently these snakes process their food.
That's the idea. It would be super insightful. And he even talks about the possibility of genetic sequencing to pinpoint the exact genes responsible for those growth variations.
So we're talking about like zooming in on their genetic blueprint and finding the specific instructions for size.
Pretty much. It's amazing.
It feels like we're entering a whole new era of cornsnake research thanks to this study.
I think so, too.
And the best part, it's not just limited to scientists. Anyone can contribute to this growing body of knowledge.
You got it. Citizen scientists, breeders, hobbyists, even just casual observers. Everyone can play a role.
This is a team effort.
Absolutely. Every observation, every bit of data, every question at all helps us understand these incredible creatures better.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I can't wait to see what future research uncovers.
Me too. But before we sign off, I have one final question for you and for our listeners.
All ears.
We've talked about the potential pros and cons of smaller size in super tesseras, but could this size difference also be a sign of something else entirely? Could it be a clue to a hidden evolutionary adaptation that we haven't even thought of yet?
Whoa, now that's a really interesting question. It makes you realize we've only just scratched the surface of the Tessera morphs' secrets.
Right. There's so much more to learn.
And that's what makes the natural world so amazing. It's full of surprises and mysteries.
It keeps us curious.
To our listeners, I encourage you to stay curious, keep observing, and never stop asking questions.
Because who knows? You might be the one to make the next big discovery.
We've covered so much ground today, from the basics of the Tessera morph to that surprising size difference in super tesseras. We've looked at possible explanations, talked about the implications for breeders, and even pondered the bigger evolutionary picture.
And we've seen how one tiny genetic mutation can have a huge impact shaping a snake's appearance development and maybe even its survival strategies.
It's a testament to the power of genetics and the interconnectedness of life. But for now, we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this adventure.
Until next time, keep exploring the amazing world around you.
All right, so we've been talking all about Tessera cornsnakes and these super tesseras that are on the smaller side.
Yeah, we've gone pretty deep into the genetics.
We have. And, we've talked about how smaller size might actually be good in some cases, like if resources are limited or they need to be extra agile.
Right.
But I'm thinking now, how does all this translate into the real world? What about the breeders?
That's a great point. I mean, all of this genetic stuff, it's super interesting, but it's especially important for breeders, right? They're the ones making decisions about which snakes to pair up.
Exactly.
So knowing that super tesseras tend to be smaller and have those slightly lower hatch rates, how does that affect their breeding practices?
Well, it seems like the first thing breeders would need to consider is the size they're going for.
Yeah, for sure.
If someone wants to produce those big snakes, pairing two super tesseras together might not be the best way to go.
Definitely not. And then there's the whole hatch rate thing, too.
Right.
Breeders, they got to factor that into their plans as well. It might take a little more time and patience to get those super tessera babies.
It's not as simple as just putting two snakes together and boom, babies.
Haha. No, not quite. There's a lot more to it than that.
Definitely a lot of planning involved.
Absolutely. And beyond just the practical aspects, there's also the ethical side of things, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Breeders should be upfront with people about the size and the hatch rate stuff associated with super tesseras.
So transparency is key.
It is. It's about setting realistic expectations and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Like a little disclaimer. Hey, these snakes might be small, but they've got big personalities.
Yeah. Something like that.
It's really interesting how this deep dive has taken us from these tiny little genes to all these big questions about breeding and ethics.
It's all connected.
It really is. It shows how scientific research, it's not just some abstract thing. It actually has real-world applications.
For sure. And for anyone listening who might be thinking, well, I'm not a breeder, so why should I care about all of this? I think there's a bigger lesson here.
I think so, too.
What we've learned about the Tessera morph, it reminds us that genetics, it plays a huge role in shaping all living things, not just snakes, but humans too.
Yeah, it's like this hidden code that affects everything about us.
Exactly. And the more we understand about genetics, the more we understand about ourselves and the world around us.
Who knows? Maybe what we're learning about cornsnake genetics today could lead to some amazing breakthroughs in human health down the line, or even help with conservation efforts.
It's all possible. That's what's so exciting about science.
You never know what you're going to find.
Right. And that's why this deep dive, it's been so cool. We've gone from those basic genetics to talking about breeding practices to considering the bigger picture of how it all connects.
It's been quite the journey.
It has.
Well, this wraps up our exploration of the Tessera morph and how it affects cornsnake size.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We sure have. From the tiny details of genes to those bigger implications for breeding and understanding the natural world.
And as always, we want to encourage everyone to keep exploring, keep learning, and never underestimate the amazing things that nature has to offer.
Because even those little things that seem insignificant, they can teach us so much.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this adventure into the world of cornsnake genetics.
Until next time, keep on learning, keep on discovering.